I wanted to watch this video by Josh Strife Hayes, which was made a while ago. It talks about how dungeons and raids should not be endgame only, which is something that I strongly agree. I think it's not necessarily a good thing that players only get introduced to raids at the end game of a game, because that makes them usually, particularly for new players, it makes it a lot harder for them to actually get into the mechanics of raiding if they're never presented with them to begin with. Now, Final Fantasy XIV actually does a reasonable job of this because it introduces raiding mechanics earlier on in dungeons, and the mechanics are kind of like standardized, which makes it easier to spot when then you go into raids and you see a mechanic and you're like, okay, here's how I dodge this, here's how I do this thing. So I think they do a pretty good job. It's not it could be better still. I believe that Josh is probably going to bring up the example of Rift, if I'm not mistaken. Again, I haven't watched this video, but I do remember a previous video where Josh was doing his worst MMO ever, or whatever it's the series that he does, and he was talking about Rift, and I think that one of the first things he did was he did a raid, like right off the bat, which is pretty cool. But let's see what he has to say.
Skirmishes, dungeons, and raids. Endgame content in many MMORPGs, often large-scale, team-based challenges where a mix of players with different classes, skills, and specializations work together to take down a massive multi-mechanic boss and earn some epic loot. Now, usual design has dungeons and raids as the content you reach after hours and hours of early game grinding, but I think dungeon and raid-like experiences should be available.
Oh my god. Josh, materia. You need to extract materia from your gear. Come on.
All players from the very start of an MMORPG. People are often saying the MMO has become less social, and we need to find ways to help encourage player interaction, mechanics which facilitate the whole multiplayer element of the MMO acronym. Then there are players saying they feel apprehensive about being thrown into multiplayer content and not quite knowing what to do, being given a...
Okay, let me tell you something about players that feel apprehensive about being thrown into multiplayer combat. Go play a single player game. That's it. That's all I have to say. I mean, Final Fantasy XIV does a pretty good job of that. You know, not really just thrusting players into uncomfortable multiplayer situations. But I feel that, you know, that's just an aspect of playing MMOs. You are going to be put into a social situation, and you are going to be expected to be able to behave socially, you know? And I think that it's almost one of the things that nowadays, what we are missing the most is social elements, even in society. You know, like you say something on the internet and people will physically, not physically, people will literally threaten to kill you. Like, you would never do this in an actual situation where you're like face to face with someone, with a lot of the arguments that I've seen, at least. Like, you're not going to go up to someone after they've said something, unless, you know, that something is inflammatory to the point where... But most of the times, people will overreact to a comment that somebody made with a death threat or being extremely vitriolic towards this person, because essentially governments have succeeded in dividing the population according to specific beliefs. They were able to implement specific beliefs that divide people in ridiculous ways. And people can't see through that. And so they just straight up will unleash all of the vitriol of the world if they disagree with someone. This is a lack of social skills. It is okay to disagree with someone and still have a conversation and even be friends with someone that you disagree with. I know this sounds crazy, but you can do this. And also, Jesus Christ, Josh, come on, man. Look at the amount of materia in his gear. Oh, stop it.
Sudden surge of responsibility for other players. And then you have old players lament how they can't team up with their lower level mates because there's very little content which applies to both of them.
Yes.
Well, early game dungeons and raids could potentially address all of these.
See, this is a big problem in a lot of MMOs. And I'm sorry, I know I'm pausing a little bit too much, but this is actually a huge problem in a lot of MMOs. The simple fact that you cannot just team up with a lower level player and still have a meaningful, interesting experience. Now, I believe you can, to an extent, do this in Guild Wars 2. You'll be able to bring like a higher level player and they can kind of like hang out with you and do quests and stuff like that and be synced to your level. You can also do this to some extent in 14 in the form of syncing people down when they go into dungeons with you or when they're doing fates with you. But the weird thing about 14 is that whenever you are doing a main quest scenario, the other player can't go in with you, even though the main quest scenario it scales you down to, to a lower level. They will not let another player go in there with you when they could just like scale the other player down as well. Now I understand that some people might say, oh, it's because it's a test of skill. It's like, there's not a single challenging scenario in 14. I mean, there might have been one or two scenarios where I might have failed a couple of times because I had no fucking idea what I was doing. But even then, like, would that really be something that's like, oh, you broke my immersion because there was a higher level player there? It's a decision of the players. I feel like that is one of the biggest things that they need to fix in 14 is allow MSQ scenarios to be played with another player. Is it the solo scenario? Yeah, there's tons of solo scenarios while you are doing the MSQ where if you are partied up with someone, the game will actually tell you you cannot start this scenario until you leave the party with this other person that you're in. There are a lot of points like that in the Final Fantasy XIV quest line, which makes it very much a solo experience. Exactly, like Crash is saying, hate leaving party for solo duties. They should just let the other player go in there. And as a matter of fact, they should include the other player in the cutscene. Guild Wars 2 actually does this. Like, even when you are doing your personal story, the other player can be in there with you. They can be in there helping you. It will scale them down. And on top of it, they even show up in the cutscenes next to your character. Because it's really well done. And that is something that I feel could be a big improvement when it comes to 14. Another thing that they should consider doing is also with the duty support system. There are, you have the duty support system. You can only go in there alone. What if you could go with 2 players and bring in 2 NPCs so that you're not bothering other players from the queue because you want to maybe do the dungeon slower because you're teaching someone still, But basically, yeah, there definitely should always be something to gain from having a lower level player help you out. And this is something that I've talked about even in the case of Monster Hunter. Like if I bring somebody new into Monster Hunter, if I jump into their quest, I'll just delete the monster with like one full burst. What's that experience going to be like for the person that's with me? It's like, well, that wasn't that fun, right? So there should be things that kind of like scale you down. This is actually something that I would like to see in every multiplayer video game, like some kind of a syncing system. It could even be optional for the people that do want to be able to just go in and delete a mob in a lower player situation, but, give you the option to actually make it meaningful for both players. And this is something that I feel like a lot of developers are not considering.
Things without compromising the solo experience. So let's discuss. Welcome, I'm Josh Strife Hayes. I've played a lot of MMORPGs, and one of the design choices I see most often, a trope of the genre if you will, is dungeons and raids need to be endgame content, as in you must slog through the rest of the game to get to them. And I find this a shame, because dungeons and raids are some of the best experiences you can have in an MMORPG. They facilitate multiplayer content, allowing you to team up with your friends or the community as a whole.
I've said this multiple times. In a lot of ways, Dungeons is almost like a self-contained Dungeons and Dragons adventure for you and your friends. I don't know how many of you guys actually played tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, but that to me is the ideal thing that a dungeon should do. It should work pretty much like an environment where you go in and you are doing like a Dungeons and Dragons adventure with your friends, which is interesting because you can see that Josh actually has Dungeons and Dragons stuff in his background as well. Oh, he's got Nightfall. I have this box as well, the Nightfall box. I don't have the I have the North or whatever it was, the last one, but I have all the other ones. I have Factions, Nightfall. There was one more. It was Factions, Nightfall, and I forget which one the other one was. But yeah, I had all 3 of them. Well, the other one was the base game, probably just Guild Wars.
Also a great way of teaching new players mechanics, both relevant to their class and relevant to the in-game environment specifically. If your game is going to become about dungeons and raids, then setting that as the foundation is a really good starting point.
Yes.
You build off what your game will become with a simpler version of what it will become. New players that are joining your MMO for the first time, or experienced players coming from another game to yours, don't want to feel that they're playing through an irrelevant section of your game before getting to the good bit, what it could be. People don't want to feel like your early game is filler, and one of the best ways to make players feel that they are always playing something relevant is to allow dungeons, raids, or multiplayer group content to be available from the very start. Before we begin, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. You've been asking if I'll put the Patreon names on 2 pages. No, I won't. The text will just keep getting smaller. More information on how you can support at the end. For now, let's talk dungeons. To understand why I feel this element of MMO design needs to be pushed far more, we need to understand the strengths of player choice in roleplay games, the strengths of player interaction and ease of access in multiplayer games, and how they combine within MMOs. Let's start with the basic foundational strength of the RPG genre. We're not going to look at multiplayer yet. Take some of the greatest RPGs of all time.
Wait a minute.
Morrowind.
Whoa. Bro, you guys see how much money Josh has in his character? I mean, you can't see it right now. Let me rewind a little bit. Look at the amount of money Josh has on his character. What the fuck? Like, this is literally like, where's the level of this character? Does it even say? It's level 3. Level 3 Arcanist has 1.4 million gil? What the fuck? What is this? Excuse me? Like, forget about the rest of the conversation. This is what I want to talk about. You got a materia problem, and you have 1.4 million gil. The fuck? You said streamer privilege? Well, let me see. MSQ Mask of Grief. This is a level 50. Okay, it is a level 50 quest. All right. So he might have been on one of those servers that have the preferred realm thing, and he reached level 30 and he got a mil gil. Okay, that's reasonable. Okay.
RPGs of all time, Baldur's Gate, Morrowind, The Witcher 3. They all focus on allowing the player to explore a variety of gameplay styles and taking on challenges with a slight personal touch. Are you focusing on magic or melee, light armor or heavy armor? Are you slow and calculated or brash and aggressive? But beyond that, they are designed so the player gets to experience the strength of the game relatively early on. If the game is focused on narrative choices like Baldur's Gate, you'll be making narrative choices quickly. If it's focused on tracking and hunting monsters like in The Witcher 3, you'll be tracking and hunting a griffin as your first task. If it's about encouraging open world exploration like Morrowind, you'll be sent off to join a guild. These are gameplay elements the game will build on for the rest of the game because they value them. They lay the foundation for the groundwork for what the game will become very early. Put simply, if an RPG game knows that its endgame experience is a certain type of gameplay, it will prepare you as a player for that type of gameplay from the start. It may even use a more toned down, simplistic version of that gameplay as the training in itself. There's a reason that single-player RPGs don't pad themselves out with kill 10 of this or collect 10 of this, because they know that design is padding and not necessarily engaging. If the game itself is a giant challenge, everything it will give you is preparation and training to take on that challenge at the end. MMORPGs have great challenges at the end game. It's just such a shame that the early and mid-game experience is less about preparing for the challenge and more about wasting the player's time until they reach the challenge. Now let's look at some of the more popular multiplayer games, not necessarily RPGs, just multiplayer experiences like Minecraft, Fortnite, or League of Legends. In this footage specifically, me playing Fall Guys. Bear with me, this does make sense. I believe one of the greatest strengths of these games is you can invite your friends to play and be playing with them almost immediately. You tell them about an awesome new game you found or a game you've played for years, they download it, and then you're gaming together. You may be highly skilled, they may be a beginner, or you may both be beginners, but you can play together. And here's the important touch. You can both do the thing that the game is good at or is known for quickly. You can build in Minecraft. You can start shooting in Apex Legends. These games do not make...
Now, there is something to be said about this analogy that I'm not sure if he goes into it later, but there is something to be said about these games, and that is that they are much more shallow experiences than an MMORPG, I would argue, right? It is true that it is very easy to just like, I mean, I'm assuming it is very easy to just like start playing Fall Guys, get a friend in, it's like, okay, let's go play Fall Guys, and boom, done. There you are, you're playing Fall Guys. I'm assuming Fortnite be the same thing. It's just like, oh, get a friend, boom, get into Fortnite, we're both playing Fortnite. Yay, let's go have fun, right? Yes. But at the same time, these games are much more shallow experience. They're not as in depth. Like, you're not going to get the satisfaction of bringing down a raid, right? Bringing down a raid boss from playing a little bit of Fall Guys or Fortnite, or so I would imagine. This is why these games appeal to widely different audiences.
If only I could be so grossly incandescent.
Flaro, thank you very much for being grossly incandescent for 2 months. Tip of the hat. Appreciate the support. Thank you very much.
Play through hours of early content before rewarding you with their best. For example, with Fall Guys, it took me about 30 seconds from launching the game to finding a game and playing with the community. Now, I know that MMORPGs are much more complicated, but what we're looking at here is the multiplayer aspect of playing with other people easily. And now I'd like to ask a simple question. When you're talking to your friends about MMORPGs that you have played, reliving the epic adventures that you have had, and you're trying to convince them to come and play with you, what kind of things do you talk about? Now, I broadly see people bring up two main topics when trying to advertise their MMO experience. Either difficult achievements they have worked toward and completed which they're proud of, like killing a boss, or finally getting a rare achievement, finishing a jumping puzzle, or crafting a mythic item, which would make sense because the RPG element is designed to value this progression. Or they talk about multiplayer experiences they've had with friends, from chilled, relaxed evenings chopping trees and fishing together, or more dramatic evenings delving into dungeons or hunting rare loot in dangerous places, which makes sense again because MMOs are multiplayer games. The strongest and most powerful personal anecdotes, though, are often combinations of both of them. Overcoming difficult challenges with your friends, like beating a boss together.
Yes.
When you're trying to convince your non-MMO playing friends to come and join you, you will tell them about all the amazing stuff that you can go and do together. Multiplayer experiences such as dungeons and raids. But what then happens?
And then after you tell them, dude, come play the game with me, it'll be great, dude. And then when you convince them to come and play Final Fantasy XIV with you, all you got to do is play 500 hours of MSQ. And they're like, what? I thought we were going to do the raid. Weren't you talking about the raid? And it's like, yeah. Right after you play the 500 hours of MSQ. I'm going to be like, but that's a big investment. Hey, Jay, how you doing, buddy?
Happens when that person joins the game for the first time and realizes they are hours, days, in some cases weeks away of both the experience and being able to team up with you. More often than not, when a new friend joins a new MMORPG, they now have to go through hours and hours of early game before reaching the fun bit that you were talking about or that you are at. And it's very hard to keep the energy and enthusiasm of, yeah, it's going to be amazing, we're going to go on adventures together, when you know you're following it up with, but first, several hours, possibly weeks, of early game grind. I had this exact experience when I tried to invite new friends to play essentially any MMORPG with me. The realization that if I stayed on my high-level character, they were hours away from anything we could do together relevant to both of us. And if I started a new character, we would both be hours away from anything remotely challenging worth teaming up on. Now, this is an issue with the linear nature of constant power gain in an RPG set in a multiplayer world. If you balance content for a certain power level, it is impossible below and irrelevant above. You're essentially creating brackets of gameplay experience, and if both players aren't in the same bracket...
Is MMO power leveling a symptom of bad design? In a way, yes. Because if the leveling is not interesting enough, then yeah, there's bad design there, because your leveling experience should be interesting. Like in the case of 14, you have an interesting story. Hopefully will keep you engaged with the game long enough for the game to get its hooks in you. In World of Warcraft, their idea is just like you just skip the leveling experience, which, interestingly enough, this is something that you see them do in their other games. This is something that they're considering for Diablo 4, where it's like, oh yeah, for future characters, we have this battle pass, and we're going to give you boosts. You're going to be able to just like boost through the leveling experience. It's like the leveling experience should be enjoyable, and it should be able to provide rewards for even high-level players, helping lower-level players level up. Herein lies the problem. There's a lot of times there's just not enough motivation for a higher level player to go back and play with a lower level player, which is what Josh is talking about. Because ultimately Josh is saying like, okay, so it's going to take you weeks to come and do anything that is relevant to me. But what about if me just helping that person level up would also give me some kind of a reward, a meaningful reward even, right? 14 in a way kind of does this through the roulette system, but it's not enough. There needs to be even more there. That is one of the biggest problems of MMOs, particularly established MMOs, which usually get much better over time, but then the new player situation becomes completely untenable because there's so many hours of stuff that you have to do before you get to the current content. Mars Blood, thank you very much for being with us for 8 months. Tip of the hat. Appreciate the support. Thank you.
They can't enjoy the game together. Imagine the impact on early game player retention if multiplayer games like Apex Legends or Minecraft or Fortnite or even League of Legends simply did not let high-level and low-level players play together. And if both players start again as low-level, they must both go through hours of early game experience before the multiplayer challenge opens up. The MMORPG combines the RPG-style gameplay with the online multiplayer element, and ironically, it does neither of these very well in the early to mid-game. If your endgame is dungeons, raids, and bosses, and your early game is 8 to 20 hours of fetch quests and kill X quests, you have not laid the foundation for what will eventually become your core gameplay loop, and so you can't teach the player the relevant skills they need to succeed.
But the interesting thing is, this is what is expected. This is what the MMO community expects, which I find it's incredibly fascinating if you really analyze it. This is what we've come to expect. Like if a new MMO comes out, what exactly do you expect you're going to be doing in the first couple of hours? Well, naturally, I'm going to be questing, where I'm going to be presented with the backdrop of what this game is about. I'm going to be given the story, the scenery. The quests are supposed to take me to places so that I become acquainted with the map and all of this stuff. These are things that we essentially expect from games. And it's so interesting that we're watching this video and then later we're going to play the PTR of New World, because I think that's going to provide us with even more context around this. If you're lucky, a tutorial. Yeah, in a lot of ways, the starting experience of the MMO is basically a tutorial.
Succeed within that gameplay loop. And if you're trying to team up with your friends and you can't until you've played many hours of single player experience, then you're going to fall to the wayside against multiplayer games that encourage people teaming up from the very start.
Yes.
You're not playing to the strengths of the RPG, and you're not playing to the strengths of a multiplayer game. So how do we fix this? Well, one solution would just be to boost the new player to maximum, level scale them up to their friends and let them go and do a raid. This way their friend doesn't lose any progress and it skips the early game irrelevant grind and makes playing together effectively instant. But doing this brings up to their friends and let them fall to the wayside against multiplayer games that encourage people teaming up from the very start. You're not playing to the strengths of the RPG, and you're not playing to the strengths of a multiplayer game. So how do we fix this? Well, one solution would just be to boost the new player to maximum, level scale them up to their friends and let them go and do a raid. This way their friend doesn't lose any progress and it skips the early game irrelevant grind and makes playing together effectively
No, but the thing is, it also at the same time, you're not capturing the attention of the player, of the new player. You're not really capturing them because they're going to be sent out. Like, imagine this in 14. Imagine somebody trying to do an Endwalker raid in 14, 5 minutes after they created their character. Good luck. You're not going to have a good time. This person is going to be basically the floor inspector. It's going to be Preach's character. They're going to be inspecting the floor the whole fight. with probably some pug healer going like, look, this the fuck is wrong with this guy? Keeps dying. Stop doing the dying thing. What are you doing? Yeah, it's weird. Not to mention it doesn't give, there needs to be some kind of a period of adaptation to the game itself. Quinn69, anyone? Exactly.
But doing this brings up one of the most overlooked aspects of multiplayer content. It is remarkably scary for a new player to be thrown into multiplayer content with a level of responsibility you have not been trained for. The pressure of knowing other people are relying on you when you don't know what to do is quite intense. And when I say don't mean what to do, I don't mean specific boss mechanics, I mean a foundation understanding of your class, role and skills within your team. Traditionally, the tank will use taunts to grab the trash mobs and then pop some mitigation while the DPS burns them down, but if you've been leveling a tank class and the early RPG experience is kill X, collect X and talk to NPCs, you won't have experienced needing to taunt, mitigate or manage aggro for other players. A similar thing happens.
And this is why tanks don't use their cooldowns. Bum, bum, bum.
Healers. Healing yourself is very different to healing others, and knowing to prioritize the tank is something that we all take for granted, but a new player won't know. Even DPS players know you need to focus the enemy healers first or the fight is going to be longer, but common sense to us is actually years worth of solidified knowledge and is not obvious to a new player. So what we can ideally start looking at is a low stakes but highly educational experience within the early game of an MMORPG that new players and old players can access together that will place them both onto a relatively simple, level playing field, potentially scaling the higher players down to make sure they're not overpowered.
Yes.
It will give the new players foundation knowledge of what the end game is going to become. It will allow them to experience their class and their
See, the way that I was able to keep Q interested in Final Fantasy XIV was we would be doing Palace of the Dead. Every time that I would have like some free time, hey, let's get together, let's go do some more Palace of the Dead. Because that was one activity that we can both engage in. It scales us. It gives me no extra power. Well, actually, I would have extra power because my weapon would be more powerful. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's not like you're burning through everything. So we did a lot of Palace. And at the same time, when I was doing that, doing Palace also would give me a very low chance of getting materials for the relic that I was grinding for Shadowbringers. So think about this. A piece of content that requires only level 14 or something like that. I forget what level you need to be able to go into Palace. You know, a piece of content requires you to have at least one job at level 14 was providing me at max level with rewards. At a low rate, mind you. At a low rate, but yes.
And responsibility within a party of players, hopefully giving them the confidence to step away from this training dungeon into a more complex, difficult endgame experience. It doesn't need to be anything complex within the narrative of the world. Maybe the king is recruiting for guards and has created a training course where the players need to navigate some dangerous terrain, fight some trash mobs, and then kill a boss, and you've got a variety of enemies, healers, ranged damage dealers, crowd control mechanics. And as you progress through, there are NPC trainers explaining the situation to you and which of your specific skills you will need to complete this challenge most effectively. You are effectively hiding a class and dungeon tutorial within the narrative of learning how to be a guard. This training dungeon doesn't need to be super complex, it just needs to be challenging enough for a new player to feel trained, tested, and then rewarded. And hey, if you're still nervous about your role within a group with other players, this dungeon can have AI-controlled bots filling the roles you're not playing, and you could have them explaining why they're doing what they're doing so you understand their roles as well. And if you're still unsure about the potential for this system, consider this. A max level player will often finish a new dungeon or raid having fought side by side with their friends.
Who would be hesitant to support a system like that? It'd have to be crazy.
Then they'll sit back and think, that was awesome, because that is what their game can be. Now, as a new player, what moments have made you sit back and think, that was awesome? It's unlikely to be the 15th kill 15 bears quest, and yet this is the vast majority of early game experiences. If new players cannot have engaging, awesome experiences with their old friends because there's no content bracket they both share, or they're too nervous to level boost, they will try to convince their old friends to start new characters. And if the old friends kindly do this, they'll then realise those awesome multiplayer moments are hours and hours away, replaced by the not very awesome experience of grind, which is a shame. Let's look into combining the strengths of the RPG, foundation experiences building into greater challenges, and the multiplayer elements of multiplayer games, easy to join groups, by building the endgame foundation from the start and letting players experience it together. Your game shouldn't begin at endgame. It may become extremely challenging at endgame, that's fine, that's actively encouraged, but it needs to start preparing the players for that challenge from the beginning. New players want to look at the most challenging content like dungeons and raids, stuff they can't do yet, and then they want to look at what they're currently doing and be able to see relevance or connection. They want to hear the amazing stories from their friends and then go have similar adventures or experiences knowing they are working toward them. If your game ultimately becomes something because that something is the best your game can be, then versions of that something need to be available for all players throughout the game. The MMORPG is a fascinating genre which more often than not, unfortunately, combines the weaknesses of all of its individual parts, when instead it needs to start combining the strengths. The strengths of the RPG being you can create your own character, your own class, your own series of answers for the questions and challenges the game is going to throw at you. And the strengths of the multiplayer element, the ability to go on this adventure with your friends or with the rest of the community at large, available extremely early in the game. Group content is vital to the survival of an MMORPG. Group content should not be a reward for enduring the early solo content. Group content should be a vital and accessible part of your game from the start.
Yep.
But what do you think? Should dungeons and raids be available from early in the game, or should they remain a reward for finishing the rest of the game?
Most
Are
definitely.
they a useful training tool, or should players know what they're doing before even joining? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers for watching. Another massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. You can support from only £1 a month. Check the video description for links to the Patreon, Twitch, Twitter, and Discord. And as always, have a great day.
So there's another point that I found very important there, which is when he's talking about should you know what you are doing before you jump into a dungeon. This is something where you are going to find a lot of friction in MMO communities, because a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, you got to know what you're doing before you jump into encounter X, even if that encounter was released literally 30 minutes ago. There is an expectation by a majority of the community, yeah, watch a guide. And it's like, bro, the content creators haven't even had time to play the content, and you're asking people to go watch a guide that doesn't even fucking exist, and you yourself haven't even watched it. Watch a guide. Know what you're doing. Literally 30 minutes before the fucking the shit is even in the game. That is definitely a huge problem. People need to be more understanding of new players trying out new things. And that is one aspect where the MMO community tends to fail. And this is like almost regardless of game. Yes, in 14, a lot of times the community will help out in the more casual content. When it comes to Savage, Extreme, or Ultimate, every single party finder group that you join is going to be like, know what you're doing. Every now and then you'll find the occasional practice group, but like 99% of the groups are going to be like, know what you're doing. Watch the June Bob guide, watch the Mistake strategy, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be something like that. Sometimes they'll even just put a link to a YouTube video in the fucking party finder listing. Right? So it's like, know what you're doing. Don't waste our time. It's like, bro, this content's 30 minutes old, okay? Relax, Uranus, okay? Unclench and just chill out. Just unclench a little bit, just a little bit, all right? There's this concept of like wasting your time, and it's like, look, what do you think video games are? Video games are, by definition, a waste of time. A waste of time that is meant to be entertaining. But yeah, like Kadame is saying, that's not a problem with the game. That is a problem with gamers in general, because that's just the way that we go about it. But I wish that the community itself was more accepting of new players coming in, because that is one of the things that a lot of people do not understand. And I do mean that. Like, people might think that I'm exaggerating, but no, my experience in MMO tells me that a large portion of people do not understand that new players jumping into a game is literally the lifeblood of that game. That is what is sustaining that game. Their ability to engage and retain new players. The moment a game cannot attract new players, your game is going to die. It's just that easy, all right? The moment your game is so complicated, nobody is willing to show a helping hand to brand new players to your game is dead in the water. But anyways, when it comes to the rest of the topic of the video, I fundamentally agree with everything he said. Yes, we should have more dungeons and more multiplayer activities that are relevant for all player sizes, and that gives the higher level players a motivation to actually go and do that content. We need more of that in video games. More, particularly in MMOs. You need more and more of that in MMOs. So that, there's a reason for the higher level players to team up with their new friends so that they can bring their new friends into games. Super, super, super important. Which is why I said, like, Palace of the Dead in Final Fantasy XIV. Fantastic system. But yeah. Let's make sure to... I'm going to link you guys the video. Remember what I usually say. You guys go and check out the video if you want, but leave it playing in the background at least, or just leave the stream and go watch it if you want to. But don't just go in there, like the video, and then leave the website, because that's actually bad. So I'd leave it playing in the background, go there later, watch it, throw Josh a sub, because he does amazing content.